싶은 말을
Appreciation to all of the people who made this conference possible. Those of us who come from abroad do understand all the problems and the troubles it is to organize such a conference. And we are deeply appreciative of the role of the Master here at this monastery for making us his guests and for treating us with such hospitality. I also thank all of you who come out to hear these talks. We hope that I will try to make just a few summary remarks about my paper since it's possible for you to read it, and leave time, I hope, for questions and discussion, which will be of greater interest than my reading the paper. Let me say that I believe that part of the issue before us today is that scholarship on East Asian Buddhism has had a certain history, and that history affects much of what we say here today. All of us who are in the scholarly world are influenced by it, and we are here today to try to communicate with one another, but also to be self-aware of the way in which we study this tradition. The unfortunate part for us is the fact that the study of the Chan Zen tradition of East Asia has primarily been focused on Japan and China in scholarship, and that the work with Korean Son as academic and scholastic study has been delayed. It is now beginning to be studied, and the fact that we're here at this conference is an indication of the importance which is being placed on this study. However, because of this delay, we know very little in the Western world and other places about Korean Son. And I think that that's one of the issues which we would like to partially rectify by this conference. Let me say I'd like to just summarize a few of the comments which I wish to make, primarily about the Buddhism itself. First of all, I think that when the study of Buddhism started, in particularly the course of it in the 19th and early 20th century, that the situation here in Korea was very difficult. Buddhism had been proscribed by the government for many centuries. It was a situation in which it did not have a real role to play in the literati or in the intellectual community of Korea. Therefore, when Westerners and others first came to Korea, they had no one to tell them about the importance of the Son tradition, and as a result, very little work was done on it. I think that Japanese Buddhism has been quite different. Japanese Buddhism has never been outside Asia. So when I turn to look at the Korean Son tradition, then I wish to say that we need to recognize that there has been a very small group of scholars who have begun to make available to at least the West. These early groups of scholars have paved the way. Of course, there are many scholars here in Korea who have broken the ice. We also have to look to people like Sundae Park, to Robert Buswell, individuals who have pioneered in the study. The significance of Korean Son for the study of the entire so-called Chan tradition of East Asia, and I wish to make a few comments regarding this. First of all, I believe historically that we need to look back to those monks who went to China were not just tourists. They went there, they stayed all of them stayed for at least 12 years. They went to China in the 9th century, and who came back to Korea to found the 9 mountain schools of Korean Son, represent for us exploited in our studies. We need to look exactly at what we know important is just because they went there, they were deeply trained in the traditions. I was one of these people who was there, who was trained, who came back to say something. What did they say? For our information. So if we look at what has been developed by these people, we can say that after 6 centuries of translating Buddhist materials from Sanskrit into Chinese, for a period of 185 years, no translation is important. That behind that lies the fact that China had turned its back. This is so, and I maybe nobody, but I think that it's extremely important. The other thing that they came back with, I think, is the fact that if we look at Korean Sung, we can see that the idea of one transmission in one generation was a later invention in China, and that when we look at the people who transmitted the Dharma to the Korean Song monks of the 9th century, we understand that multiple transmission was a truth and a fact. I think that this is something which everyone in a sense knows, and that is in the 9th century we find a different story in Korea. Once again we look to Korea for an answer, and that is that later on by the 12th century the Korean monks were deeply involved in the problem of trying to bring about a reconciliation and a harmonization of the textual and the practice schools. Again, I think we need to turn to see what was happening in the world. And the reason that I say this is that I think that there was a great shift in the role of text which happened in the Northern Sung. After years of no translations, 185 years of no translations of Buddhist texts, of very little attention being paid to texts, when the Northern Sung dynasty came into power in 971, one of the first things they did was to put the Buddhist canon onto printing blocks. In 983, texts were being translated again. At that time, when text became once again a crucial and important part of Buddhist life, then we find an attempt to harmonize the textual tradition with meditation. There was a change in the social perceptions of the history, and we have to say that ideas about the role and importance of text must be reflected in what was happening and being done to the texts, whether they were being translated or being printed. Even though this harmonization was started, another thing happened to the Koreans that I have already mentioned, and that is that during the Joseon dynasty, in a very sudden way, the government removed all support from Buddhism. It suppressed Buddhism. It restricted it from the capital cities and from the capital city and other cities of Korea. There was a suppression of it, which meant that Buddhism was removed to a marginal position, had no ability to deal with the educational system of the country, which was then placed in Confucian academies. In 1471, the court stopped printing all Buddhist books, so that during this period of suppression, the idea of harmonization with the textual tradition began once again to fade out of Korean life. The focus was not on text, because text belonged to people who were trained to read Chinese. Textualism was something that belonged to the literati, and the Buddhists were denied access to it. And so during this period of time, the Buddhist tradition here in Korea moved once again to a radical position of mind-to-mind transmission and meditation. I think that when we see these rhythms in history appearing over and over, that we have an understanding that here in Korea we can see a reflection of what was going on in China. We can see here in Korea a reflection of what was happening politically here in this country. And that as we look at the tradition against this, we can understand that Buddhism has always been affected by and has responded to the social and historical climate of the time. This is not to say that there were not spiritual decisions being made, there were. But I believe that the intensity with which those spiritual traditions were shifted has also to do with issues which were happening outside of Buddhism and were affecting Buddhism. And lastly, I'd like to say that I think that one of the great failings that we have in the study of the Chan Zen Song tradition is that we do not study contemporary forms of it. That our study of it is far too much oriented to ancient history. And I think that this is true in Japanese study of the Chan Zen tradition, that the study relates to the form of Chan which was present in China before its transmission to Japan. And after that transmission, there are very few studies made of the developments within China itself. Chan continued to exist in China. Chan was a part of the Song and the Ming and the Qing, but we see very few studies of it. The same thing happens here in Korea. People study the Three Kingdoms and the Unified Shila and the Koryo. I think that we also need to study carefully what was happening to Song during the Chosun period. And as a closing remark, I'd like to say that many people say that at the end of the Chosun dynasty, Buddhism was a decadent, defeated tradition which had been stripped of its power, which had become a mere shadow of its former self. I see it very differently. I see a tradition that after almost 500 years of severe repression, a tradition which had been treated so poorly by the government, not only were they suppressed, but they were forced to do labor for making paper for the government. They had to carry officials in their sedan chairs. They were put into a position that was little less than that of a slave. And yet, this tradition, treated in this way, excluded and made marginal to the culture, survived. And survived to the point that there were still great meditation masters emerging here in Korea right through the Chosun period. Otherwise, what we see here today with all of these bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, these are the representatives of a tradition that was able to survive and revive. So rather than seeing Chosun Buddhism as something which was despicable, I think that it shows us the power of the patriarchal system. It shows us the power of meditation, and therefore I believe that it behooves us to give very careful study to Chosun Song to understand how it could do this. So with that, I will close and say that I look forward to any of your comments or questions. Thank you.
한국선의 역할과 의미 또는 역할과 중요성이라는 논문에 대한 논평자로서 이 자리에 앉은 중앙승가대학교에 있는 본각입니다. 랭카스터 교수님은 세계적인 석학이십니다. 거기에 이제 소장 학도인 제가 논평을 한다는 것은 대단히 송구한 마음이 듭니다. 랭카스터 교수님을 처음 뵌 거는
me to just make it short so that we can reduce time. I'll summarize in English her ideas. Okay, I'm very honored to have a place with Professor Lancaster.
많은 불교에 관심을 갖고 계시는 제가 불자님들 또는 선원에서 수행정진하시는 우리 선방 수자 스님들께서도 관심을 가지고 이 자리에 임하고 계십니다. 때문에 랭카스터에 대한 연구를 하셔서 그것을 세계에 알리는 데 큰 역할을 아마 평생의 과업으로 지금 연구를 하시고 박사님의 전공 자체가 한국불교 선이라는 것을 또한 말씀드립니다. 시에 걸치는 아주 장문의 논문이십니다. 그리고 지금 박사님께서 영문으로 번역을 하셔서 제가 논평에 들어가고 질문을 말씀드리기 전에 그 전체 논문을 좀 요약을 해봤습니다. 그것을 우리 청중으로 계시는 모든 분께서 같이 박사님의 논문을 이해하시는 데 도움이 되셨습니다.
When when patriarchal sun was introduced to the Western world at an early stage, it was done by Catholics, priests, and colonial officials. So, in that process, the patriarchal sun was
한국선에 대한 연구나 모든 행위가 문서로서 남아있고 그리고 가시적으로 서구사회에 전달될 수 있는가. 그동안 한국선을 그 사회에 알리기 위해서 많은 노력은 했지만 중국이나 일본의 학자들 또는 선사들은 어떠한 그 연구의 그 결과를 문헌으로 또는 가시적으로 남긴 데 비해서 한국선을 하고 있다. 그렇기 때문에 앞으로 한국선을 알리는 데 있어서도 그러한 문서화되고 가시적인 것을 우리가 전달할 필요가 있다. 이런 지적을 하고 계십니다.
So it is important to understand.
그 자료집 페이지 31페이지를 보시면은 서구인들이 그 불교를 이해하는 데 있어서 청교도적인 불교 이해가 있다. 그래 이 청교도적인 불교 이해는 이제 저희도 그 참 생소한 용어인데 그것은 그 시대 역사상에 나타난 정신운동가 또는 개혁자 정도가 아닌가 하는 이런 해석을 하고 있는 것을 청교도적인 불교 이해라고 띄어 말씀을 하십니다. 여기에서 이제 저희 하나의 그 코멘트 11개 정도로 저희가 가능한 것입니다. 이런 것을 우리가 좀 생각하는 생각이 듭니다.
That it is Protestant Buddhism, which is rather than a principle of practice, it is a thing that I want to raise a question. Can this product, Korean Sun, can Korean Sun be delivered to Western world in forms of religion or otherwise in the form of philosophical practice?
그 문헌 자료적으로 이야기를 할 때 구산 선문이 전해진 그 8세기에서 9세기 초에 중국의 그 사회상을 보면은 불교 사회에 있어서 경전이 전래되고 그것이 번역이 되고 편집 또는 연구되던 것이 아주 활발하던 것이 8세기와 9세기 초에는 그것이 휴지기에 들어갔다. 거의 활발한 그 활동이 없었다. 이러할 때에 신라의 그 구산선문을 개청한 신라의 승려들이 그 중국에 가서 그이들이 느낀 것은 어떠한 경전 문헌적인 연구보다는 바로 명상 실천 수행법인 선을 강조하는 그러한 면을 갖고 신라에 와서 신라 선법을 전하지 않았겠느냐. 그러한 것이 이조를 통해서 오늘날까지 한국선은 어떠한 그 경전 연구나 그 교학의 바탕을 얻어서 선 사상을 전개한다는 것보다는 바로 불입문자하는 그러한 것에 강조된 전통을 갖지 않느냐 하는 구산선문의 그 전례에서 하나는 단전이라고 하는 거에 좀 문제 제기되고 두 번째는 조사선을 강조하는 데는 그 시대 상황이 경전 연구와 번역이라는 것이 휴지기에 들어가지 않느냐 그런 말씀이에요. 저는 지금 같이 이제 그 포함되는 질문인데요. 선불교가 중국이나 한국에서 불교 해불 시대의 정신적인 지주가 되었다면 선의 부정적인 평가라고 할 수 있는 은둔적이고 폐쇄적이며 비사회적이라는 지적과는 어떤 관계가 있으며 이거 좀 박사님의 말씀을 듣고 싶고요. 반대로 우리가 이제 희망을 갖고 미래사회 우리 전부가 여기 모여있는 모든 불자들이 선불교야말로 미래사회의 정신적인 주가 될 것이다 이런 희망을 갖고 있습니다. 그렇다면 21세기 선불교의 가치가 인정이 되고 또 해불 사건이나 그런 아주 그 이조시대와 같은 그러한 사회 환경이 아니라 정말로 평화로운 시대에는 선불교 특히 이제 한국 선불교와 지금 그 한국 선불교가 지금까지 취해온 그런 태도와 그런 방법으로 좋은가? 아니면은 다른 어떤 방법, 새로운 어떤 것이 있어야 되는가? 여기에 대해서 이제 박사님의 의견을 여쭙고 싶습니다.
Okay, I have two.
Korean Son is the antagonism toward monasteries, and the question of whether monastic life is valuable or not. Certainly in Europe and North America, we have a Protestant tradition which is very negative to monastic life, whether it's Catholic or Buddhist. On the other hand, I think we see the value of monasticism because it is the basis for our Western university and college system. The university in the European Western sense grew directly out of monastic life. The campus is a place where students go into a period of seclusion for study and to be trained. This tells us that this type of life, where people are set aside from doing normal activities in order to study and train, is very valuable. So my first comment is that I believe that Son Buddhism should not lose its nerve with regard to the importance of monastic life, nor should it attempt to get rid of monasticism in place of having a social service tradition which copies Western religious social service activity. And the reason that I say this is that I believe that Buddhism teaches something that is very different from the principles of social action in the West. Buddhism, it would be, I think, if we all approached each other from the point of view of, I am like you, I suffer. It doesn't matter how much money I have or how little. It doesn't matter how much education I have or how little. It doesn't matter how strong I am when I work out at the gym or whether I'm a weakling. It doesn't matter. We all suffer. So my recommendation to you is be very careful of trying to imitate and aid a Western social service approach to life and to put down the importance of your monastic system.